I was going to ask. Yeah, maybe. Hi, welcome to NetMod. Our first session. We have two sessions today. I'm Lou Berger. We have Kent Watson, who is remote. At some point, Joel, the other co-chair, I think is going to show up. Hopefully he does. Mahesh is going to be sitting here with me, helping out with the session and with Jabber, although I'm on Jabber as well. As usual, we're using Etherpad. The URL, I think, is here. It's the URL is here. Please do join in and help with our collaborative note-taking. It's very helpful to do that, and it's also a good opportunity for anyone who speaks at the mic to make sure that their name is appropriately captured and their comments are accurately captured. So please jump on this URL. You can also find it off the tools page or off the data tracker page or off our agenda, any number of places. This is the IETF, which means we have some rules governing what we do here and what's said here and what makes it into our minutes and becomes part of our process. Basically, anything you say in this room during this session is part of our permanent record. We are using YouTube for video as well as recording audio, and so please be aware of that. The blue sheets are going around. As I mentioned, myself and Mahesh should be on Jabber. If for some reason you do see something show up in Jabber and we don't take note of it, feel free to come to the mic and to relay a question as you see it. The agenda has changed a little bit. I'll get into those details in a moment. So we have two sessions. The really important thing to note is we have a room change. So this afternoon we are not in here. Why we're not in here, I don't know, but just be aware. On to document status. So since the last meeting, we do have one RFC. I have to say, when I saw that this was since the last meeting, I thought there was a mistake because I felt like we were done with this a long time ago. But it does sometimes take a long time from when we finish something in the working group to we actually have the RFC. Thanks to all who contributed to this. It was an important piece of work. Of course, I'm biased because I think it's useful. We have two documents that have been submitted for publication. I thought we were going to have a update on that from the authors. I think they decided they're just going to speak at the mic and give us a brief update. Now, Adrian, I thought, had volunteered to do it, but I don't see him in the room. Adrian, are you in the room? You're not. Kent, do you want to say anything about artwork folding?
Yeah, hi. Just quickly, it's been in the ISG for a little bit, and the main thing right now is that Ben could have review it again after we made some updates to the script. He wanted to ensure it was actually a batch process compliant script and would work on multiple platforms.
Great, thank you. I'm going to drop you off. Come back in queue if you want. Oh, they did it for me. So we also have Yang data extension that's going through processing. I don't think there's anything really that interesting to talk about. The post last call, we have a few documents. The first is module tags. That actually left the working group and then came back to the working group. That was because it didn't have the state appendix, the NMDA related state appendix in it. I believe that's been produced. I should know that answer. I am at least a contributor, maybe a co-author on that, but really Chris Hops is driving that work. But it came back to the working group. It's been updated. We expect to have a second last call on it next week. We have a couple of documents that have been through last call. They did get some comments. That was a little bit of an extended last call. We're going to hear from Rob Wilton on that in a moment. I clicked the wrong button. Let's see if this goes the right way. Okay. One more document that's post last call is factory default. We've had, I think, some discussion on that. The last call was ended on the 15th. I don't believe the Yang Doctor review came in. It was assigned, but we're still waiting on that. There is an IPR poll going on. We're missing one response. At least there was when I wrote that on the slide. And that will, of course, block submission to the ISG, but we expect that to progress nicely. And Kent, who's the shepherd, is going to wait until he gets the final revision before doing his write-up. Not on the agenda. That's interesting. Geolocation was not on the agenda when we put these slides together. It's actually on the agenda now, so that's incorrect. But we have a couple of other slides, a couple other documents that are not on the agenda. NMDA diff and the 6991 BIS. Is there anyone who would like to? Alex is pointing out, I think, that he's now on the agenda. And so the only one we have is 6991 BIS. I don't see lead author in here, so I don't think we have anyone who can talk to it. One of the entertaining things about this BIS is I happen to be, because of one of the geo document, I happen to be looking at the reference for our definition of date and time, and I realized that we're pointing to a definition that is several years out of date that came, I believe it was from, I don't remember who the standard was, but we reference an RFC that references maybe an ITU standard that's literally 3 revisions out of date. Joel made the nice joke about, at least we have stable time, which is, it's good to have stable time, but we probably should figure out how to update the reference as we move forward. I'll mention that to Jürgen. The agenda is pretty tight. Since the first item came up, we've added the schema comparison document. That's noteworthy because that is the last sort of building block that's necessary to satisfy all the requirements from the revision handling and the revision design team. So they now have a complete set of documents covering the requirements. We're going to spend a lot of time on that because that's a really important work item for the working group. Our second session, we've also managed to fill up interesting font conversion here. The stuff at the top, I guess, must be more important. At least it looks larger here. So we have updates on a couple of working group documents and then a couple of other documents which are individual contribution. We've seen, may have seen the list discussion related to ECA and the 2 different documents. I think the authors have been working hard to figure out how they can combine their work, and I suspect it's a merged contribution at this point, but we'll hear that in the afternoon. We have one liaison. It's actually a communication that came in since the since the IETF doesn't have a formal liaison relationship with ETSI. At least I don't believe we have one. And it's really just to be aware of what work they're doing. So if you're interested, please take a look at the link. It is posted on the list. You won't find it in the liaison listing because we don't have that formal relationship. So this is just a communication. It's interesting. Do take a look. And with that, we're going to go over to Rob. Yeah, it works. What, 1 sec.
Okay, so I'm going to try and give you a very quick update on these two models. They're post-working group last call. So first, apologies, I've been quite slow processing the working group last call comments. I was intending to do that over the last couple of weeks, but I wanted to get the final versioning draft out to try and get that work to progress at a steady pace. So that's why the sub-interface draft updates haven't yet been finished. The interface extensions draft, I've applied most of the working group last call comments. There are a few open issues waiting for confirmation from the people who submitted the issues. I'm going to cover some of those today, just in case anyone does want to give any feedback, but I'm not sure. I mean, they need to be covered on the list anyway. And the sub-interface draft, that's still in progress. So hopefully these should be completed fairly soon, sort of next couple of weeks or 4 weeks, a month. And then we'll get those done. So into the issues, the first, one of the ones that's remaining is, do we rename the carry delay function? So this is a feature that delays normally a hardware state change so that you can allow some other protection equipment to kick in, or in the case an interface is coming up, you can allow it to stabilize before you start running traffic over that. So this carry delay is the name that we've used within Cisco. There's a suggestion maybe to change that name. Couple of possibilities is link flap suppression or state flap suppression. I don't know if anyone has any comments on this or not. Assuming nobody stands up, I will continue to try to progress on the list. Otherwise, I'll either keep it the same or change it if nobody cares particularly. The next issue is there was a proposal to add an in discards overflow counter. So this would be a subset of the in discards counter. So I'll add that one, and an in discards unknown end caps. Again, that was discussed before. So I'll add both of those counters in. The definitions of what those would be I've sent to the list. There was also discussion about whether to add in packets and out packets counters. So the way that the counters are defined today is they're split between unicast, multicast, and broadcast. And the expectation is that for packets that are okay, well-formed and not dropped, they fit into one of those three buckets. But for interfaces that don't have that split between those three, it's not quite so useful. It would have been nicer if they defined an in packets and out packets counters, and then the broadcast and multicast were subsets of those. But having said that, I don't think this document's the right place to add those. And I think further discussion will be required. So the plan is not to do that now, and it could go into a future revision of IETF interfaces if it was required. Any comments?
AC Lindum Cisco Systems. Isn't it if the client could derive those from just adding them together?
Yes.
Isn't it that we don't add a counter that just if it's not, but if it's different, it depends on the definition whether they're needed or not.
I think the case where this came up, the concern was for some interface types, you may not know the split between unicast, multicast, broadcast. So which bucket do you put those in? Because it's going to be misleading. And I think it was maybe the policy models they wanted to refer back to this counter, possibly. And their concern was that doing the maths in XPath becomes sort of convoluted, whereas you had a single counter, that would be easier. So there was justification as to why this could be useful. I do agree that logically it's equivalent to adding these three together. And I think the last issue, and this came up in the last working group last IETF, sorry, and that was to change the name of L2MTU. That wasn't liked as a name, and that's changed to max frame size. So effectively, this is reporting the maximum size of frames that you can send and receive over the, well, normally a physical interface, but it could be a sub-interface as well. Before, the definition had a tweak to be fairly closely aligned to 82.3 that allowed some flexibility as to this size changing by 4 or 8 bytes to account for the fact you've got VLAN tags on the packet. In the end, I decided to actually take that out and make it more generic. Another change is to include the FCS bytes that, again, were excluded to try and make it more aligned with some of the other counters that we have. And then the last change was to increase its size from UINT 16 to UINT 32 with the aim of accommodating the Linux loopback MTU, which is 65536. So that's the new text. I will get Lou to read afterwards because he previously mentioned an interest in this. Yes. So again, that's on the list. If I don't hear back, I'll assume that what I'm proposing is fine. And that's the last slide on these. Any questions? No.
Thanks. I was just reading what you wrote.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay. Next up, we have Lodge. I hope that works.
Hello.
You'll have to stand a little closer.
Hello, Balázs Tengel presenting instance data format, which is next slide, please. Doesn't. It's getting quite stable, and I would like by now. First of all, I'm sorry for publishing the draft just yes, day before yesterday, I think. Yeah. Concept is still the same. We want to document data that will be available offline, server capabilities, preloading data, and a lot of use cases, XML, JSON encoding, multiple new ones can be added, add metadata for the whole data set, and content, it will be similar to what you would get from a GET reply or a GET operation reply.
Just say next.
Next, please. So what has changed since the last IETF? First of all, we had this entity tag and last modified timestamp, which was from RESTconf, and a number of people thought it useful. Another number of people thought that it's uncertain how it should be used. It's quite RESTconf specific. After the last IETF, there was an email discussion on this, and it was decided to remove it. Maybe later reintroduce if there is a real need. Then just very lately, on Andy's suggestion, I added this YID Yang instance data version. So if this specification ever needs a revving, a new version, then we'll know that we go from YID version 1 to 2 or 1.1, just that this specification is the first version of the instance data format. Then there was some discussion about the full inline schema specification method. It is now made optional. And just the days yesterday, maybe, and Andy at least came up that he thinks it's too flexible. He wants just Yang library as a base, but earlier, I think two IETFs earlier, there was a discussion on this where it was decided that we want a very flexible solution, so it's not just Yang library module format that can be used, but any other format as well. Anyway, now it's optional based on a feature. Then I added, based on the last IETF discussions, the simplified inline method, where for each module you just have to specify a single string, like in this example, and we will come to an open issue at the end about the exact format of the string. Next, please. So, and that, on Martin's proposal, I added a wrapping container around content schema. So to wrap the whole choice, three methods in the container, so to cleanly separate them and rename some of the options. The blue parts are the ones that changed. Simplified inline was added. Inline module and inline schema, I think they were just called module and schema before. And then we have the feature for inline itself. Next, please. There was a Yang doctor review. I updated the draft accordingly. Hopefully didn't forget anything. My English needs some updates as well. Security considerations. So this is not a normal Yang module because this is not intended to be accessed online. Basically, it doesn't have any way, it doesn't involve any way of modifying the server or the publisher's behavior. It's pure read-only in a sense, and it's for files, so file handling security should apply. Then this .yin for schema naming, I'll come back to this in open issues. And there was a statement that I said that the Yang module revision for content-defining Yang modules should be mandatory, because otherwise modules can change between revisions greatly. But it was commented that some modules might not have a revision date at all. So in that case, we can't have a revision date that was added. Next, please. And this is the example of how we look after all these changes. So you see that the YID version 1, which is always one for this RFC, and like we have it 1.1, fixed 1.1 for Yang 7950. When we have here the simplified method, and yeah. Next one, please. Yikes. This is next. Maybe this, yeah. We have one major open issue raised by Andy and Martin, that in the draft I used for the simplified inline method, I used a format that is very similar to how we name Yang modules. For example, IETF Yang library, the module name, the revision date if it exists, but I think it will be existing 99% of the cases, and then .yang. They said that we should not have .yang or .yin because it's not a file. For me, this is a simple, short method, but we could, as an alternative, just say IETF Yang library date and then not dot nothing. To me, that's somewhat unusual, but yeah, it can be used. Or we could use a more complex solution where we have a list with two leaves for module name and revision. I don't want that because I was specifically asked to have a very simple and short solution. So it's either one or two. I can live with two if Andy and Martin really wants that. And I think I covered all the other open issues, hopefully, and I hope it can go to work group ASCO now.
Robert and Cisco, so just a quick comment on the module naming. So with the Yang versioning work, we also want to be able to name Yang modules using the revision label as well. So I think I sent a comment to the list yesterday that it might be nice to have this slightly more flexible, so it's not tied to, it has to be the date. You could, for example, have a Yang Semver in there instead, or anything else, another string.
First of all, I agree with you. Second, I would rather make that a BIS and not wait for the full revisioning part dependent on this.
Yes.
I can't really, I don't know, if I can put in something later, revision label may be used instead, but that's rather uncertain at this point. I don't know, chair. So if I put here a sentence that instead of the data, revision label, which is undefined at this point, can be used, is that acceptable?
So I'll state a personal preference. I would prefer that you define what can be done today, and then if there's a new format, that be an update to this. That's a personal preference. It's not a chair statement.
Okay, so I think you could possibly get away with just defining it more loosely and
Sorry?
I think you could define it more loosely, because again, there's not a tight format that's going to be defined. I think that it necessarily matters, or maybe it does. I don't know.
I want to say here that if you have any kind of revision date, revision label, whatever available, you must put it here. So I want to force people to put there some information about the revision.
Okay.
Yeah, label could be used.
Okay. A comment from Jabber. This is from Andy Bierman. He says, please just use Yang, not Yin.
Is he happy with the second solution? So instead, removing both .yang and .yin.
He'll have to answer that. What he put in before you asked that question was number one is okay. He didn't say
Okay.
the other one is bad. So
Okay.
he just answered number two is okay too from his perspective.
Okay, then I'll stick with number one if he's okay with that.
Okay. Yeah, I think once you address what you believe are all the open issues, explicitly say that and say the authors think it's ready for last call, and we can go from there. I can't speak for my co-chairs, but
This is a minor issue.
Yeah,
so if we can revise this in.
That'd be great, and it would be good to get this document done. So
Okay.
Thank you. Interesting, Kent. I just saw this late. Kent says he prefers number two with a contributor hat on. So I think we heard it from Andy. 1 and 2 is okay, and Kent saying he prefers 2. So
then let's go with 2 because Martin might prefer 2, I think, as well.
Well, Martin is on, but also this sounds like a good list discussion. Oh,
Okay.
wait, Martin did say he prefers 2 also. So
Okay, now let's go with 2.
Rob Wilton is going to kick us off with the design team. First design team. Document.
Okay, so no, wrong one. We want the overview one. That's Bo's. That's the next one.
Yeah, I'm worried if it's got screwed up in the upload. So
That's it. Fine. Okay, so I'm going to give just an update and overview of what the design team's been doing. Just an overall summary of the solution space, and then we've got individual drafts covering the various aspects of the solution that's being proposed here. So in general, in terms of what the design team's sort of covering, I'm going to give a quick update. Bo's going to talk about the updates to the revision modeling draft. Joe's going to be talking about updates to semantic versioning draft. I'll be then talking about Yang packages. Joe will be talking about the schema version selection draft. Rashad would have been doing that, but he's not here. And then I'm going to talk about the draft that we published last week, or actually maybe it was the weekend, on schema comparison. And then maybe there'll be some time for the next steps discussion at the end. So in terms of design and team update, we've been meeting on a sort of semi-regular weekly basis since IETF 105. Lots of good work has been done. So I'd like to thank you to everyone who's been participating in that work. There's lots of various people at one time or another. In terms of the main output, the solution overview draft has been trivially updated. That's not particularly interesting. The shape of that hasn't really changed. There's been updates and some relatively minor changes to the module revision handling draft that Bo will talk you through. There's been quite significant updates to the Semver draft, the packages draft, and the version selection drafts we'll talk through. And then there's an early revision of the schema comparison draft. So to put this all in perspective, I think we're at the stage where we're going to hopefully discuss whether this complete set could have working group adoption. So that's what I'd like you to keep in mind when we're discussing these drafts, please. So covering the individual drafts, the requirements draft, that document is stable. There's been no changes since IETF 105 and none are anticipated. So that's just sort of sitting there at the moment. Again, in terms of the solution overview, the updates that have been fairly trivial, just updating the references to the 5 different solution drafts. It hasn't yet been updated with the schema comparison draft because that was too fresh. But it's worth pointing out here that the shape of the solution, the component parts, hasn't changed in scope or size. So that's relatively minor. A recap of what the overall solution space looks like. So these are the 5 drafts. The revision, the updated Yang module revision handling, primarily that's about being able to notify when MVC changes have occurred through updating the revision history. It allows a revision label to be associated with a revision, and that's a mechanism then used to put semantic version numbers in. And it also allows a branched revision history. So RFC 7950 doesn't say that you actually have to have a linear revision history of modules, but that I think was the intention, the expectation when that was written. So this clarifies that you're allowed to have a branch revision history if you want. As I said, it adds revision labels. So that's sort of the core draft for updating Yang modules. Then overlaid on top of that is a semantic version number scheme, and that allows the use of semantic version numbers for labeling or for versioning both modules, and it's also used in package versioning as well. The Yang packages draft talks about, rather than doing versioning of single modules, about sets of modules together that represent a Yang schema. So it sort of uplifts the work to be discussing larger units of work. That then plays into the package version selection draft, and that allows servers to support different versions of the schemas and allow clients to choose which of those schema wants to interact with via various mechanisms. And then the final draft, the one that was posted on the weekend, was the schema comparison tooling draft. So that explains how you can compare to modules or to Yang schemas like Yang packages to detect what the changes are between those, and it defines some annotations to make that tooling work more efficiently. So that's still an early draft. There's still more work to work out exactly what things need to go into there, but I think that the aim here is it shows you the shape of that solution. And then this is sort of showing you what the dependencies are between the various drafts. You can see the module revision handling one sits at the top, and that the packages draft uses that. The semantic versioning scheme is optional, so if you're making use of it, you have those dependencies. The package version selection depends on the packaged version schema, obviously, so that's what they look like. And then, as I said, so the potential next steps and the outcome of this is we've been working on this, the design team, this overall solution for quite a number of IETF cycles. I think we're at the stage where we would like to know that the working group supports the direction we're going in. So that's why I think we might be at the stage where working group adoption of this set of drafts to agree that this is the right direction would be a good discussion to have. Now, I'm not suggesting we necessarily have this now. Hopefully there's time after we've presented on the drafts to have that discussion.
When you said you're not sure about having it now, what was it in that?
Well, discussion about whether we think that asking for working group adoption of these drafts is the right thing to do as the next steps.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect question for sort of setting up the next batch of slides. Okay. And that we should ask this question at the end.
Okay.
I think you are actually the, I don't know if it's you or Balaj who's going to present the last one.
It's me, actually. Yeah.
What's that?
It'd be me.
So please leave a couple of minutes to ask this again. And working group, please pay attention to these with the expectation that we're going to ask if the documents are ready for adoption. Now, of course, we always confirm things on the list and we're not making any final decisions, but I think it's important feedback from today to sort of set that direction. Yeah. Thanks.
That's my last slide on that one.
So now we're on to Bo.
Just take it off.
Okay. Here. Hello. Good morning. Like as Robert said, that this draft is the solution to the Yang module revision update. So here is a Yang module revision update. The main updates to the Yang 1.1.19.1119-1000. The core enhancements to the Yang 1.1 is that these updates explicitly said that non-linear module development is accepted. And also, since it is non-linear and there could be like non-backwards compatible changes in each revision, so this document defines the non-backwards compatible change revision extension to each revision that in each revision, it must be specified if it's non-backwards compatible changes. And also, this draft defines that it must specify the revision label if it's a new revision. Although the revision date is added to specify each revision, but the revision label is also must to be added. And also there are other updates like the revision date or derived used as an import. That is the change to the previous one that import you either specify the revision date or it's optional, but this one is given another option. The other changes are this draft improve the young status. No changes make the non-backwards compatible is more clear, and also this draft also update the guidelines for updating young modules revisions. So here is a recap. And since last meeting, the major changes is the revision label, that when use a revision label, then it must take the young SAM version format. And the other major one is that each IETF module with a new revision must include a revision label that is conforms to young SAM version. So these are two major changes. And the other minor changes is this draft import revision identifier when defining the young module, and the minor improvements to the text and modules. These are main changes.
Rob
last
Wilson, just a quick clarification. So for the revision label, it's not compulsory. You don't have to have one of those, but it's saying that if you do have a revision label in there and it looks like a Yang Semver number, then it must be interpreted that way. So tooling can interpret as a Yang Semver, and clients can interpret that way. So, but it's still optional as to whether you include a revision label. You'd be allowed to use revision dates on your own modules. We're saying in IETF modules they have to use revision labels.
Okay, so my understanding maybe is that revision label is mandatory, but actually it's not.
For IETF modules, we're saying it has to be a revision label. It has to be used Yang Semver. But if you had your own proprietary native Yang models, you can use revision dates if you wish to do so.
The revision date is mandatory, but the label is optional to add. But
yes,
if it's as a label, then it must conforms to the format of Yang SAM version. So right.
It doesn't have to. So again, the revision labels, it doesn't have to be a Yang Semver, but if it looks like a Yang Semver, it's interpreted that way. So you couldn't have a proprietary revision label that looks like a Yang Semver but actually has a different meaning.
Okay, thanks. Then this draft, the open issue to this draft is that this draft tries to solve the potential 7950s ambiguity of this, like when implementing the Yang modules, that in existing defining that imported module revision is ambiguous, then choose the latest revision. And in this draft, propose another a different definition that if imported module revision is ambiguous, then choose the implemented version rather than use the latest one. But it could otherwise, when there's no implemented revision, then resorts to the latest import-only version. So the question to the working group is whether we fix in this module versioning draft or if that could be I think may not be Young Library errata, right? It could be like 7850s errata, I believe. So this is a question to the working group. So the other open issue is that this draft is still working on the non-backwards compatible changes, and also what will be the backward changes added more list because existing Young 1.1 has defined a list of what is backwards compatible changes, but our draft is thinking we may add more to improve this definition. So also we are thinking whether we give an exhaustive list or we give some generic one that unless reasonable client, then changes classify as MBC. So here is the order for this draft.
Questions?
Just a clarifying comment, Joe Clark, Cisco. On this, as we've discussed this, Balash in particular has come up with other things that potentially break backwards compatibility or haven't been considered. I honestly don't feel an exhaustive list is possible. I think we'll always find some corner cases. I think we should probably err on the side of non-exhaustive with some kind of clarifying verbiage there to say we're trying to do the best thing we can for the client, and if we aren't certain, better to err on saying something like NBC, non-backwards compatible.
So of these open issues, which do you think need to be answered before adoption?
Rob Wilson, Cisco, neither of them. I think we can adopt it and resolve these as part of the regular working group work on this document.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Joe, I think you're up next.
All right, that's me, Joe Clark, and this is the version, the Yang Semver work that the design team was doing that Bo alluded to. So we had a little module dance here, or draft dance. We originally made module versioning the related to document, and then we had to go back. So now Semver does stand alone, but there have been some changes. There have also been some things that have stayed the same. So in particular, between 01 and 00, we have not changed the syntax and rules. So the modified Semver, and I'll recap with an example here in a second, that Rob described in a previous IETF, I think 104 or 103 even, that has stayed the same. The notion and the definition of NBC, non-backwards compatible, backwards compatible, or BC, and editorial changes stays the same. We did officially or formally define editorial changes in the 01 draft, and modules can still have a semantic version associated with them through the revision label. And as Rob and Bo were talking about, that if you're using a revision label that looks like a Semver or a Yang Semver, and we'll look at what that format looks like in a second, then tooling must treat that as a modified Yang Semver. That's important with respect to vendors because a vendor version might look like a Semver, quite honestly. So you have to consider that maybe you need to precede the starting major version in a proprietary vendor string. I'll, being at Cisco, use one of ours like 16.3.2, looks like a Semver, but you might have to call it v16.3.2 to instruct the tooling that this should not obey the modified Semver rules. And these rules are here on the slide. So we obey the Semver 2.0.0 syntax. And in fact, one of the changes we made in 0.1 fully recognizes that syntax. So we have a major version component, a minor version component, and a patch version component. That's all 2.0.0. And then we add this m, lowercase m or uppercase m modifier. And you can see there that how those are applied. And those are sticky. Once you add an m or a lowercase m or uppercase m, those are sticky. And this allows us to tag our specific branches while we're using that the Yang module versioning rules in terms of that lineage that we talked about in the last meeting. The one exception here is that beta or pre-release versions, that is if the major version is a 0, all bets are off. As you're developing before a release, an initial release, you can continue to make backwards compatible and non-backwards compatible changes. You just use a 0 for the to denote the major version number. Formatting aside, this is an example. This was previously presented. I just egregiously stole this from one of Rob's previous presentations, and you can see how the versions are applied, the version numbers or components are applied, where NBC changes show up, and then how the M and the M, the uppercase M and the lowercase m are applied. And those, again, would be sticky within those sub-branches like 1.1.1m. That would be sticky as 1.1x keeps going on. So what's new? What has changed since 0.0? If you've read this, and hopefully you have, you've noticed that when we use the word Yang module in the 0.0 revision, we've changed it to Yang artifact. I'll admit my embedded thesaurus may not be the greatest. Artifacts tend to be used in some coding parlance within the industry. And the reason we wanted to genericize this a little bit was to recognize that Semvers can be applied for other things. And in particular, Yang packages, which Rob will talk about in a few minutes, we wanted that to also be able to be versioned with a Yang Semver. So we changed where module is needed, like when we're doing import revision or derived, that we still use the word module, but in general, we genericize module to be artifact. The Semver construct is no longer an extension, like a top-level extension, whereby that is what you directly import from. Instead, it is now a revision label. And we'll take a look at kind of how that transitioned. Though you can still, if you choose to import from a Semver, you're just saying, I want to refer to this particular revision of a Yang module by the Semver. But the linear or lineage or the lineage import is still how the tooling will resolve that. Since we're no longer updating the core tenant of Yang, we pulled out the update 7950. We did add full support just for completeness for the full Semver 2.0.0 spec. I'll talk about that in a minute. And we formally defined the regular expression, the Typedef, for what a Yang Semver looks like. And we restated the rule that we talked about and Bo mentioned. If something looks like a Semver, a Yang Semver, then tooling needs to treat it as such. So those were the main changes. Digging in just a little bit to some of them, the old 0.0 had this top level per revision. It was a Semver module version. And we were saying that initially was how we were going to do the Yang versioning. And now we've moved on to something that's based on the revision lineage, but we can optionally label a revision with anything we want, and this document defines the pattern for that Yang Semver. And if something again looks like a Yang Semver, then tooling has to treat it as such. In terms of full Semver 2.0.0 support, the one thing we hadn't addressed previously is that Semver 2.0.0 offers this metadata for both pre-release and build. And so we just expanded our regular expression to say, we'll allow that if you want to have that as part of your version string, but it has no applicability to the Yang tooling. So Yang tooling will effectively ignore any of that build or pre-release metadata, but we will allow it. It will not break our Typedef definition. And finally, the Typedef definition itself. So that is the regexp to look for a Yang Semver. And I believe that's the last slide. So questions on what we've done, changed, kept the same with Yang Semver?
Yeah, Charles Eckel. One question, you brought up the example of Cisco using, I think, version.
You know, do you mind leaning into the mic?
Yeah,
Sorry,
sorry.
we have background noise. I just can't hear you.
Okay, using software version numbers in their Yang models that sort of look like Semver, but
Yep.
aren't. Just, you guys probably put some thought into this. How is that going to, you thought about the negative ramifications of that? Because those models aren't all going to be like renamed to like add a version, like to add some string. I mean, those Yang models are out there and they're going to remain out there and being used for a long time.
Right.
So what's going to happen? Have you just thought about that?
So fair point. Let me go back to this. So the revision label, that would have to be a new property that they would add anyway. We're not saying they need to change the name of the module, but if they wanted to adopt this, meaning if they wanted to adopt the whole lineage-based, provenance-based import and non-backwards compatible, backwards compatible change, everything we're presenting here essentially, they would have to mark in their new revisions that this is the revision label that we're going to use, and then they have to be aware that if they were to like 16.3.2, like I said, that and they don't want users, because this is mainly for users to look at this and say, okay, I understand that between this version and the last there have been some non-backwards compatible changes, that they would have to use something that does not look like a Semver, that doesn't match that regular expression. So if they don't want to adopt this, they have to do nothing.
Okay, so yeah, I see now. This is you're keying off of this, which you can. Okay, great. Missed that. Thanks.
So Rob Wilson says, just to add one clarification to that as well. So you could so Charles, you could just put a next like an R3.1.0, and then that becomes non-Semver. So you just anything that means that it doesn't follow the strict format is fine. Thanks.
Balázs Lengyel Ericsson. My first idea would be that you have a revision label called Ericsson : 3.1.
Cisco-16.3, yeah. Anything that would break the regex evaluation. All right. Thank you very much, chairs.
Just as a heads up, right now we are running ahead, which means folks who are in the second session might be bumped up to this session. But sometimes we end up running back. The discussion continues if we end up going back on schedule. But just as a heads up for those who are presenting later. So right now I think we have Rob Yang packages.
So the third of our drafts that we're presenting on Yang packages. So I've presented this one at least once before. I'm going to give an overview of what it is again, just to remind you what they look like, and then I'm going to talk about what we've changed in here. So this one's had more significant updates in terms of the details and more things added to it. I don't think the overall solutions changed in terms of what it's trying to achieve. It's just more refinements. So what is a Yang package? We know what a Yang module is. So a Yang package is where you take a set of Yang modules together and use them to define a schema. So what a device might currently report in Yang library via module sets and things, you could also report them via Yang packages. It could define the same thing. So why do we do something new here? Well, there's two things we're trying to do. One is the ability to define these things off the box. So rather than being tied to what the server's returning, the ability to put them into an instance data file and use those. Well, you could still use Yang library to do that. But the other key change here is that the packages are hierarchical. So the idea here is that you can define packages and then import those in the same way or include them the same way that you would include modules and build up more complex schema. So an example is IETF might define a package for basic router functionality that defines some modules, and then they might define packages for L2 VPN or L3 VPN or routing package, and those packages would depend on those base ones, and you can effectively build together more complex sets. As I said there, in terms of the package information, it's available both on the box. At the moment, it's augmenting Yang library. I'll talk a little bit more about how it does that, and it's also available off the box. One of the other key changes that's come in here is to add checksums for integrity checks, both of the modules and of the packages themselves. And the idea here is that if you know what the package is at design time for a particular version, then your client doesn't need to download the full set of modules, the full schema from the device, and check whether it matches what you need. If you know that it's what you expect the device to have, you can just check it has a package that is either what you expect it to be or backwards compatible with what you expect it to be, and avoid that sort of more complicated checking of the schema. So it sort of moves some of the work that you would naturally do at design time definitely into an option of doing it at design time. So the problems that we're solving, we're aiming to solve several things. We also want to be able to version more complete schemas rather than versioning single modules. We want to be able to version schemas or sets of modules together. And one of the main aims here is that today, if you look at IETF or you've got OpenConfig, there's many different Yang modules for different features and different protocols, and each of those can evolve separately, which means that vendors may choose to implement different versions of those models. They might implement version 2 of OSPF and version 1 of ISIS. Another vendor might then implement version 1 Yang module of OSPF and version 2 of ISIS. And it becomes quite hard to then get good interoperability between clients and vendors if vendors are each choosing quite discrete sets of modules that they're implementing. So the idea of Yang packages is by combining those together into more complex schema, you've got the opportunity of putting more linear development flow in terms of how these things evolve. Other things, as I said, that Yang packages are hierarchical. Schemas that are managed through might be made up of tens or hundreds of modules. Managing these as a flat list, it becomes unwieldy. It becomes hard for you to understand the stuff that you care about and what you don't care about. So again, the idea with Yang packages is that you move the conformance up to a higher layer structure, and you can use that and check that, for example, do you support IETF L2PN, and that's what you're coding your client against and that your client to expect, and make your life easier in that way for clients. And the last one I mentioned before was the ability to do, or second to last one, is to avoid having to download these schemas on the fly. So rather than having to connect to every device, download the full set of Yang, well, either assuming you know what it's going to be doing or downloading that full schema from Yang library and then checking it matches what you want, all the features are implemented as you expect, all the deviations of what you expect. By having these schemas defined off the box and available as instance data files, you can move that work off to be done once. So when your client connects to the router, it says, okay, I'm expecting this device to be running package, I don't know, vendor at version 2.7 or whatever it happens to be, and then you can check that yes, actually that device is running a package 2.7 that you expect, and that's fine. The schema is consistent. Or maybe it's running 2.8 and it's backwards compatible, or 2.7.1 and it's backwards compatible. Either way, it works. And then the last use of Yang packages is to give more flexibility in terms of schema selection. And the principal idea here is that given that we're now allowing non-backwards compatible changes in modules, as soon as you allow those and allow servers to be using those, then you start to break clients when you have those non-backwards compatible changes. And this gives you one method of potentially supporting clients that you could support older versions of the schema, so you don't break those clients, and whereas other clients could connect to the newer version of the schema. So Joe will be talking a bit more about the schema version selection draft and what it achieves, but it's making use of Yang packages to achieve that. So an example here, I've got an example of random IETF network instance, a network device package, and here it's listing in this package 3 modules that it implements and a couple of import-only modules. So that's listed in that package definition. And the definition includes metadata about the package, like where do you find the package, where do you find the modules, what features are mandatory. So what features are you required to implement to say you conform to this package definition. It also can import packages. That's not shown in this example, it's shown in the next one. And when it implements modules, it implements specific versions or revisions. So the idea here is that a package defines an exact schema. So whenever you download a package at a particular version, you know exactly what every single data node looks like, is the intention, if you know what features are enabled. It allows import-only modules, versions, and revisions. And then the things that have been added here more recently are checksums that allows you to know without necessarily downloading all the assets that you've got the correct copy of them. And also the other thing that's been refined more recently is more work's been done on the import conflict resolution. And the basic principle that's being applied here is that you resolve any conflicts explicitly. So conflicts might arise when you're building up packages from other sub-packages and they are implementing or importing different versions of modules. So when you get those conflicts, at the point that you when those occur by importing those two packages, you have to resolve it explicitly. You say, I'm going to choose to use this particular version of the module. So you resolve it in that way. Second example here is a basic routing package, and it's just basically to show how this works in terms of this package. The basic routing package has a dependency that includes a particular version of that network of device package. So all the modules that were defined as part of that network device package are effectively being used by this. And then it says which particular modules it implements on top of that, and it lists some more import-only modules as well that it effectively uses. So, and this is the case that if it was including multiple packages and they happen to implement different versions, so if you, for example, had the case where one of the packages was implementing BGP at version X and another one was implementing BGP at version X+1, you say, when you pull those two in, what does that combined package effectively do? What does it use? And as it says here, any version conflict change must be explicitly resolved. So you always want to be very clear when you're reading the package definition whether or not you are implementing those packages, you pull them in faithfully, or whether they're being any changed. So now going over the main changes, since 01, there's been quite a lot. So the ones I put with an asterisk down there, the ones I talked about in more detail. So some of the train changes are fairly formulaic. That the fact that the work on Yang module updates moved from using semantic version numbers all the time to using revision labels and semantic version numbers optionally applies to packages as well. So if your company wanted to use just revision labels and didn't want to use Yang Semver, then it could also define packages using revision labels with a similar versioning scheme in terms of how the modules were versioned. So this supports both. It adds support for checksums. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. It adds support for locally scoped packages. So previously all the package definitions were globally scoped. available off the box. This defines packages that are scoped to a single device. I'll explain why they're required and why they're useful. There's some improvements to conformance that I'll talk through as well. And the use of packages as definitions of instance data file schema. So again, I'll talk to this in a bit more detail, but this isn't just about using a package, putting a package into an instance data file. It's using a Yang package as the definition of a schema for a Yang instance data file. So once you've got things that define schema, that's one natural usage of them. And then finally, there's been quite a lot of minor changes and cleanup to the models and the draft and sort of reshaping it a bit. So it's had fairly significant work. Packaging module checksums. So this was a request that came in to effectively have some way of knowing that the Yang modules that you're referencing via URL or the packages you're referencing via URL are actually what you expect them to be. So the solution that we've added here is to use a SHA-256 hash of either the module or the package definitions to avoid you having to download them each time. So these checksums are written into the package definition files. When you reference a package, you can optionally include the SHA-256 checksum, and likewise with the modules again, when you provide a URL, you can also provide a checksum. And so that means that with you, obviously, if you've got those things locally within your process, your server, you may not need to download those things again. You can be sure that they match what you expect them to be. In the case of modules, the checksum is calculated on the Yang file. So effectively, this means that it includes white space changes, and the expectation here is that all instances would match. If you had a URL, you can find it from various places. And for packages, the checksum is calculated on the Yang instance data file. So the same thing. And again, that would include any white space changes, and it would include the metadata information at the top of that package. Yes.
You actually have something from Jabber first.
Okay.
So this is from Martin. Is this, meaning module checksum, because we don't trust the revision date or label? Why do you have a checksum?
It's because we don't trust the URL. So in the package definition, you're providing a URL to where you can go and find that package. And so you want to check that what you actually download from that URL matches what you expect it to be. That's one of the cases. The other case that it is useful is that, again, when a device says I'm using package IETF at 2.0.0, that actually it gives the checksum of that package. So when, again, as a client, you say, yes, it's what I expect it to be, and I can check and take the integrity of that. That's the purpose.
Okay, thanks.
I wonder how stable this module checksum is, because modules are often extracted from RFCs, and different extracting tools just add or remove different amount of white space. So I think it would be useful maybe to transform the Yang module to some canonical white space and then compute the checksum, because otherwise it won't be reliable, in my opinion.
Possibly, and that adds complexity. The one that I was really hoping to bind it to is the fact that this has URLs that list where those modules can be found. So really, it's the key for me was trying to bind that the files that are downloaded from those URLs match the checksum with them. So whether that's still required, I don't know. So the next change is the relationship between packages and schema. So talking about local packages. The aim in terms of what this work's trying to do is for each data store schema to be defined by one package. So you have a one package definition for that data store schema. That makes it very easy for the device to advertise for each of the data store schema what the package is that defines that schema, and makes it easy for clients to know that off the box. So ideally, for packages really to be useful, you want that information to be available offline, and you want it really to be available at design time. But there are cases where that becomes quite tricky. So one of the cases is that your software itself might be made up of different software components that could be optionally installed and added and removed, and hence the packages that you can generate on the device to represent the combination of software components that have been installed at that point in time can change and be more dynamic. So in this case, you wouldn't expect to be able to define offline packages for all of those things. It might be helpful to define a local package to that device that says, okay, I'm installing these sub packages, and it's those sub packages that each are available off the box, and the local package is just the top level definition to pull those all together and combine them. Similarly, if you apply software bug fixes that change the schema, that's another case that we think where you might deploy and advertise a particular package for a given software release and say this is the standard version of the software, but if some bug fixes have come along, then the schema has been changed. It doesn't no longer quite reflects that what's been advertised as the package with that software, and so you use a local package to say actually it's the same as the package release of the software, but it's got these few changes, these few additions to that schema.
So we have a couple of comments from Jabber really on the previous slide about format. Ken suggests using XML as it is lossless, and he's saying that as a contributor. Martin is saying actually the new RFC text format non-paged is lossless for text. Lou, as chair, says whatever we decide should be in the document.
Yes.
So.
And again, I don't think this issue has to be solved now before working group adoption. I think
that's really a critical point for today.
Yes, I think all these things. But yep, I'll take all that on board. That makes sense.
But as Angela Eriksson, in our practice, it's only the question of removing white space from the end of the line, which is a very simple transformation.
So we have one more from Rashad. But RFCs aren't the only source of Yang we care about. He says it as, it reads as a statement, but there's a question mark. So I think that's true. We want to have a solution that works no matter where the module is defined.
Yes.
That we can compute the checksum the same way.
Yep. And I want it to be done in a simple way. So I want it to be easy that you can to get those checksums.
But it really has to be unambiguous, whatever it is.
Agreed. So I think I've covered local packages. Just to get, I'm not sure I said to the end of these, in terms of the idea of local packages, the two key changes are that the name of the package is no longer globally scoped. So everything in terms of the other package definitions, the idea is that package name is effectively globally scoped. But here, a local package, the device could choose to define its own name for that package that may collide with that same package name on another device effectively. So that's one change. And the other one is the offline definition may or may not be available. So the device may allow you to download an instance data file containing an offline definition perhaps, but that's not necessarily expected. The idea really is it's just a way of combining packages together at the top level if required. So conformance improvements, various improvements have been made. One is that, as I mentioned earlier on, that packages can use revision labels or they can use Yang Semver, so that I think works quite nicely. And then there's been some more explicit conformance in a few places. So package inclusions define both explicitly which package version obviously you're including, but they also now state which package versions they are replacing explicitly. So in that case where you're combining two packages and you have to choose two packages of the same version through this dependency tree, you now have to explicitly state which ones you're getting rid of whenever they collide. And if one of those included packages is modified in an MBC way, then you have a flag to annotate that packaging at the point that it's included. So the idea here is that when you look at a package definition and you look at all the packages that it includes, you should be able to know whether or not the package faithfully implements those included packages. So if you had a top-level vendor package that included IETF routing, a particular version, you'd have to clearly indicate whether or not you faithfully implement the IETF routing as defined by its package definition, or it's been modified in an MBC way. Perhaps because you've got some deviations, or perhaps because you've included some different versions. So the idea here is to try and make that conformance easier for clients. Similarly, when we define the module inclusions, again, the module revision, you specify which module revision you are either implementing or import only, and it also specifies which revision or any revisions of the module it's replacing. So the case where this is important, we had this sort of thing in the draft before for the import only modules. You could say which ones you no longer needed. But now for the implemented modules, you can say, I'm implementing module version X, and I'm also effectively replacing other module versions Y. So that really matters for like the import only case, where you want to say, I don't want to have this dependency on an import only module. So feedback on that would be very useful on what we think. Packages as schema definition for instance data documents. So this sort of goes back a little bit to what Balazs was presenting on. The idea of packages is that they define a Yang schema. So they're meant to be a canonical representation of a Yang schema. Instance data documents obviously have a schema associated with them. Packages, I think, would be a good way of associating a schema with an instance data document. And the reason I think it's good is because the idea is that these package names are globally scoped, and they have revision numbers, and you have a checksum associated with them. So you need relatively little information to guarantee that you get the right schema, and it's what you expect it to be. The one thing that needs to be resolved with that, though, is sort of like the bootstrap scenario. So if you say you're referencing to a package, if you're saying the schema for your particular instance data document refers to a Yang package, well, that Yang package itself is defined in instance data document. What does it use as its schema? Is that something that it then has another reference to another package or a module set, or is it just hard-coded that the instance data library understands the instance data documents best to understand packages as a native construct or not? So that's one area I think that needs a little bit of work or refinement to make sure that doesn't get too complicated. So that covers the main changes that we've made. And then I'm also going to cover sort of the open issues. This isn't exhaustive. There's some minor things we're still discussing, but these are the ones I think are particularly interesting, and I'm most interested in feedback on these things. So the first one is whether packages should use a different structure for the instance data file representation versus what you get out of the device, e.g. from Yang library or similarly. The current approach is sort of trying to optimize for readability in the file and optimize to minimize data transfer from the device. So to that effect, the package definitions on the device reuse the module sets from Yang library. So rather than having effectively the same equivalent information in a separate tree, for the Yang packages, they just got references back to the Yang library module sets. The idea here being that you could potentially allow those same module sets to be used to define the Yang library schema and also Yang packages. So clients have the option of using both. So that has some advantages in terms of effectively that minimizing the data. There's a disadvantage of doing this though, which is the sort of more complexity in the structures and the fact that the structures differ. So one of the bits of feedback from Balazs was it'd be nice to use the same structure for both. And I think there's obviously two ways you could do that. One is you could try and augment Yang library with the packages information. I'm not sure that that easily works, because I think it fundamentally, the hierarchical nature of Yang packages, I think would then break the Yang library. I don't think you can easily do that. So I think if we wanted to use the same structure, I would instead go for the format that's used in the instance data documents and use that on the devices as well. So you'd have more repetition of this data in terms of defining the modules that comprise the packages. However, I'm not sure that's really a problem, because the intention of the Yang packages is that clients shouldn't have to download this information. It's there if they need it and they want it. But the idea here is that if you're using Yang packages, you know what they are off the box, and you avoid having to download this information. That's one of the key aims here. So the fact there is a hypothetical duplication of that operational data may not matter in reality. And so currently, I'm leaning towards changing this, but I think this would be something again that is one of those issues that we need to sort out. It doesn't have to be done again before it's adopted by the working group. It can be done afterwards. It's not a significant issue, but it's something that needs to be considered. Feedback on that is welcome. Another one that we've considered, talked about, is so Yang library definition requires that module namespaces be specified. In terms of the Yang package definitions, they allow the module namespace to be specified if you want to. So in terms of the Yang structure being used, it's included there, but it's optional rather than mandatory. And the idea here is, I think that with the JSON encoding, effectively, it's almost moved to the point that the module names are globally unique anyway. They uniquely identify the data or the namespace. So I'm not sure whether the external namespace is still that useful anymore for these things. So I was thinking that the module name, the original label, path, and checksum are effectively sufficient. By path, I really mean like the URIs where you can fetch these things from, are sufficient to be able to identify, to pull these things down. And if you need the namespace, you can get that out of the module if you want it. But at the moment, the proposal is to keep the namespace definition, allow it to be specified for people that want to, but I'm not sure it's actually needed. Again, comments on that issue are welcome. This one is, so talking about the checksums, so I was explaining how they're used. So this question here is, in the examples in the draft, I think use the full SHA-256 checksum, which is 64 characters long, I think, that's right. So these are quite long and verbose in the files. So one thing I was thinking about was, rather than using the full SHA-256 checksum, you could allow prefixes to be specified in the same way that Git allows you to use prefixes of the SHA-256 to identify particular commit hashes. You could potentially do the same thing for Yang packages. The downside with that is that in Git, it's really just using the prefix to uniquely identify a file. It's not using it to validate the integrity of that file. So I think if we're using prefixes, we'd break that integrity check probably. So the proposal at the moment is actually, let's keep the full SHA-256 checksums in the files rather than allowing prefixes. But again, I'd be interested if anyone has opinions going the other way. Use of module tags. So the draft allows you to use module tags to associate additional metadata with Yang packages. It doesn't define any mechanism to talk to the device to add or remove or modify the tags associated with a package. So the module tags draft allows you to define tags within a module definition, and it also allows you to update those tags associated with modules on a particular device. You can dynamically modify them. So the question here is whether this work should be added now. Should we add support for adding, removing, and modifying package tags to this draft, or would it be reasonable to defer that to future work? I'm not sure how useful that is. I might ask the author of the Yang, one of the authors, if he has any thoughts on this.
I think it's a low priority feature. So this is Luberger answering as contributor. I think it's a low priority feature, so I would leave it towards the end. And if we decide that the group decides that it's important enough, someone will write some text. Okay. And if at the end there's no text, I think that's our answer. It could always be done later.
Yep, sounds good to me. Packages for Uber schema. So this is an interesting one. The idea for each package is it represents a schema, and it says here potentially incomplete. So that's one of the things I didn't mention here is, in terms of the Yang package definitions, the schema that it's representing doesn't have to be complete. It could represent an incomplete schema. So it represents, say, a set of modules that they themselves have dependencies on other modules that aren't defined as part of that package. There's a couple of reasons that those sort of incomplete schemas are useful. They're useful in the case that you might have a dependency on maybe IAN or IF types where you don't want a binding to a particular version. You just want to leave it loose in the package definition, and then when the package is being used, it would specify exactly which version it's using. And again, it's also where we're defining things like packages for a bug fix or something. You just want to include the modules that have been changed in that package. You don't have to include the whole schema each time. So again, that's an example where a package might represent an incomplete schema. In the package definition, it would specify whether or not schema, it represents a complete schema or an incomplete schema. But the actual issue here is to do with NMDA and data stores. So each data store defines its own schema. So as such, each data store would have its own Yang package definition. They might be the same for the same data stores, or they could be different. But in the definition in RFC 8342, the NMDA RFC, it sort of implies the existence of an Uber schema that represents a common parent schema across all data stores. What it actually specifies is it says that the schema for the operational state data store must be a superset schema of all the configuration data stores, except you can remove some things. So you can't deviate. You can deviate, remove things to take it out. You can turn features off, but otherwise you can't change the data types. You can't change the meaning of nodes. So I think what that really means is the existence of this Uber schema on a device where the schema for each data store must be a subset of that schema. So it might have things missing. You might have features turned off, nodes missing. And it might have deviations to remove nodes, but otherwise everything else is always a subset of this this Uber schema. And this has come up as being something that's potentially useful in the version selection work, that rather than trying to select sets of schemas for the data stores, it might be more appropriate to try and select using these Uber schemas that identify the schemas across all these data stores rather than individual ones. So that's something that we're still sort of talking about and looking at, as well as the data stores on the device. The same sort of idea applies to these sort of schema families. So if you had a set of packages representing a set of IETF modules or open config modules or native modules, the same principle applies, that for those schemas, the schema for the individual data stores may differ, but they still logically have this same Uber schema that represents all the stuff in all of them at the top level. So again, we think that these may be useful to describe those things. And again, it's really the package version selection draft that's driving some of this discussion idea as to whether these are useful. One thing to add is that this came up in the alias from Andy, that he was saying that it's quite tricky for a client to know what the schema is because the schema for each data store is different. So it is potentially an idea that maybe this Uber schema that logically exists could also be advertised in Yang library, saying, look, this is the schema that acts as the schema above all the other per data store schemas. But you can calculate it. I mean, you can generate it by merging everything together. So I think there's a question whether that would be useful as well. So that one is still is open discussion on what we do with those. And I think it's really the version selection draft that drives that. I think maybe this is hopefully my last slide on this one, is once you've got these packages, one of the principal aims is to try and add some more conformity between what IETF produces. So rather than producing just Yang modules for individual features, can IETF start to produce sets of Yang modules that work together to provide functionality for particular services and things? Not service level Yang modules, but implementing those services on devices. So I would like, if the packages work gets adopted, we also want to then be thinking about, can we try and start defining what these things look like? Does it work? Can we come up with these definitions? And then there's a question of how do you manage those packages? Do we need some IANA registry for those? And the other side of that is, I would like these package definitions to be globally unique. So again, how do you manage that namespace? I'm hoping that a simple registry of prefixes on the package names is sufficient rather than using URIs that make them more verbose. But again, so there's more thought about this and how we do that and how that works. And questions on process and things. So this is just sort of early days in this. I'm not sure the draft, I think the draft mentions the idea you need to do this, but doesn't talk about the details. But again, I don't think this is something that needs to be solved for working group adoption. It's just part of the work as this work evolves in the working group. And that's my last slide on this part.
All right, great. Any other issues you think that should be addressed before working group adoption?
No, I think the shape of the document describes well what it's trying to achieve. I think most of the issues are really just working out the details. So from my point of view, no, I don't think anything has to be resolved before adoption.
Great, thank you. Looks like we have a question.
I think for now, the Yang package is quite useful from the implementing part.
Do you mind leaning into the mic? Also say your name, please.
Okay, Bo from Huawei. And here is a question because when I read this through the Yang package, I think for implementing is quite useful. But right now, I think like there's no standards to define whether how can we form a Yang package. For the Uber package, it seems clear, but we could like use only 2 modules to form a Yang package. So right now there's no standards defined in the Yang package draft. So in that way, I still think that if that Yang package could add more text to describe how to like form a useful Yang package, I think that's useful. Thanks.
Okay, that could be added. I think the idea here would be that I wouldn't want to define any actual packages within the packages draft. It has a couple of examples, but the idea would be to have separate RFCs to define an IETF base package for what modules would go into that, and one for or IETF routing, that sort of thing. So, but I think that, yes, I think it'll be tricky to define those, but.
One idea, maybe it might be useful in some use cases to include a PGP signature of the content so that it's somehow assured that it's the right packages that somebody receives. So maybe as an optional item, it could be useful to add some kind of, let's say, PGP signature to sign the checksum so that it's really the content that's supposed to be there.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks for putting us back on schedule. And Joe, I believe you're up. And so Rob has taken 5 minutes of your time.
Okay. I'm not Rashad, I'm Joe, but this is his work and he's online, so here we go. Why are we here? What is the goal of Yang version selection? Specifically, this is about addressing this requirement from the requirements draft. We need to allow for a way that existing clients have a way of interacting with a Yang driven server that is a way in which they expect, a way that's not going to break those existing clients. And we also need a way to be able to distinguish, now that we've introducing Yang packages, we need a way of being able to distinguish what version of a package we may want to use if a device happens to support multiple packages. What do we want that schema to look like? So these are the goals. This is the wherefore of the version selection draft. In particular, the solution here will allow servers to do these non-backwards compatible changes, and clients do not necessarily then have to always track the latest and greatest. So for example, a server could support version 2 of a given package and version 1 of a given package. So the clients that understand version 1 of that package can select that is the version by which they want to interact with. That is the schema that they want to see. Obviously, then, therefore, this makes use of the Yang packages that Rob just presented. And we need to have a way for the servers to advertise this support. What packages do they support? At what version do they support? And we have to be able to say this is the default version. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to do that. That's one of the open items. And then additionally, then, how does the client make that selection? How does the client say, this is the package, the schema I want at the version I want? So that's what's laid out in this particular draft. Servers are not required. This is something that we debated quite a bit on the working group. Servers are not required to concurrently support clients using different schema versions. In reality, it may be very difficult for a single server, a given server, to support two major revisions of a given package, two major revisions of a given schema. So servers are not concurrently required to support that, but they need to unambiguously indicate to the client that they are unable to satisfy a selection request if they aren't unable to render or support both versions of a given schema at once. Servers obviously are not required to support every revision or version of a given schema or given package. So for example, a server or a package version 3.0 may come out, 3.0.0, for example, but not all servers need to support that. And as well, if you've got a server that supports version 2.0.0 and 1.0.0, there could be non-backwards compatible changes there that the server can't reliably render. And there has to be some deviation to indicate that, for example, we are not going to support a node at string when it used to be int. We can't do both at the same time. So that onus is not on the server to be able to somehow magically do that, but there has to be ways of signaling that to the client that this is a deviation. This is how a server is going to handle that. Changes between 0.00 and 0.1. In 0.0, we talked about a netconf solution whereby a client selects a specific version of a schema by using a different TCP port number. And then we thought about that and we thought, well, that's going to really proliferate ports as we go. And saying proliferate ports a lot quickly is tough to do. So we pulled that out and we picked an RPC-based approach in order for netconf clients to be able to select a specific schema. In particular, we initially started by saying a client selects this particular package at this particular version, but we then started saying, and this led into some of this Uber schema talk or Uber package talk that Rob mentioned. How does a client string together multiples of these packages? So for example, if they have a L2 VPN package and an L3 how do they bring these together to come up with a overall cohesive schema that client may care about? So we added support, and still an open issue for discussion, we added support for being able to select multiple schemas. And as I mentioned on the netconf side, we changed the port selection to an RPC to be able to say, these are the schemas that I want. So here we go. A version schema is associated with, as we talked about, it could be a semantic version, it has a revision label, but it is associated to those Yang packages. And within the we have this notion of sets of schema that string together to form one cohesive schema that the client is interested in using at specific versions of the sub packages within that. We can do multiple things here. We can have the device, as Rob pointed out, define these local packages that kind of create that umbrella or group together multiple sub packages to give an overall schema. Or we can have the vendor or device manufacturer create packages offline that again specify what schema are using. Or we can leave it up to the user to be able to say, I want to select L2 VPN at 1.0, L3 VPN at 2.0, but then we run into some issues with how, and Rob mentioned this, how do we resolve some of the potentially inherent conflicts between different schema that might use, or different packages that might use different modules, or different modules and different versions of those modules. But what we want to be able to do is have a way of netconf clients being able to say this is the set of packages and versions I want, or the schema that I want, and the same for with RESTconf. And with RESTconf, we have a offshoot branch in which the client will make a query to be able to say this is the set of packages, or this is the schema at this particular version that I'm interested in. So different route for RESTconf and the RPC for NetConf. This is the version selection, the Yang tree output of that. You can see how this breaks down. We'll go into a little bit more details. We look at examples specifically of how the RPC works, and that's going to lead us into some of the open questions that the design team has been having. This is, for example, how a server will advertise support for specific packages at specific versions. So this happens during the capabilities exchange. So the server will say that I have the capability for these sets of packages. So example, IETF routing at a specific version, or at 2 specific versions, a vendor and a vendor package at 2 specific versions. So this could be, these are the list of packages that I support. This is what you as a client can request in terms of being able to say, this is the selection that I want to make for clients that understand this capability.
So we have a comment from Martin on Jabber. Why a different mechanism for NetConf, and why not use the same mechanism as for RESTconf?
Why the different mechanism for RESTconf versus NetConf? With RESTconf we had the ability of doing a different URL, and we thought that RPC, we talked about a few different things. We thought the RPC seemed more natural with respect to what a NetConf client would expect to do. So that is why that is one of the things that we debated most recently, is what should we do? We felt that the port change solution wasn't scalable, and we thought that this would be a way of being able to do something. It's more of a handshake, a negotiation between client and server, where the server could ACK or NACK that is supported for the specific client.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson. I think advertising anything more detailed than the Uber schema will lead to a lot of complications and a lot of how do we support all variations of the supported schemas.
Yeah, and that's we'll get, personally, I agree with you, and we're going to get to that in particular with the open questions in a minute here. So this is the example of the NetConf RPC. Balázs just kind of hinted at something that we're going to get to in a second here. What happens here if, in this example, maybe there wouldn't be conflicts, but what happens if the client selects a set of packages or a set of schema that inherently conflict? Obviously, you could just NACK this, and instead of returning an OK, you could return an error reply to the RPC request. But it might be better if there was a way of having a single, vetted is probably the wrong word, but a single definition for the overall schema that the client wants to use.
So that thread kind of has a continuation on Jabber. So Martin says config false data instead of special protocol capability, to which Rishad says, Martin, do you mean to have a different solution from what's currently in the document? And Martin responds saying, why not use config false data instead of special protocol capability? I thought RC was using a config false tree. Perhaps I'm mistaken.
Perhaps I'm a little confused at the question.
So, Rob Wilton, Cisco. So I think that the information of what you could choose would be in config false for both NetConf and RESTconf. So it's available in both cases. The reason we put it in the capabilities exchange for NetConf is we thought that'd be easier for a client when it connects to know what's available straight away and to be able to choose on that initial RPC at the beginning, I want to choose the schema. Whereas in the RESTconf solution, because it's done on the path-based thing, effectively, once you get the data, you can then just choose the right path. So I think it's to do with at what point in time do you choose the schema you're using and getting that early enough in the process.
Yeah, one of the things we did discuss, thanks Rob, one of the things we did discuss was when does the capabilities exchange occur, and could the client simply say in its capabilities what it wanted to use, but the capabilities exchange can occur simultaneously. So we wanted it had to happen early. We had to have some way of having in the NetConf session this happen early, and so that was the other thing that we another reason why we went forward on at least on the NetConf side with the RPC.
So I've asked Martin if this is something he thinks can be addressed after adoption, or does he think have to be addressed before adoption? So apparently, well, here, you be Martin.
Okay. Martin says, I don't think that optimization is necessary. Compare with hello versus Yang lib for modules. An additional RPC isn't a big deal.
So he gave a technical answer to a process question. And he also says there are other problems with the solution. So Martin, again, is this something we can work out after adoption, or do you think it's completely the wrong direction and we need a reset here? So he's not sure.
Okay. Well, we'll go on because there are certainly issues with this that we do need to, we need to as a group work out. So this is, I've already touched on a few of these, and Balash brought up the fact that when you are arbitrarily allowed to chain together schema, the server may not be able, sorry, Dave, I can't let you do that. So the server may knack it because the string together schema that are selected don't really work together. They can't be simultaneously supported by the device. Maybe another client in another session has already made their choice, and the device can't concurrently handle both versions, say, of a particular package. Or you might be trying to change this on the fly, meaning you did it once at the beginning of the session, and now you're trying to send an RPC again for a different schema version, and the client server can't support that. Here is a config example. Rashad is very meticulous in generating the full example of the Yang module within the draft. But let's get to the open item, since I think we are running behind. Do we allow multiple schema sets to be selected? Balash already mentioned that there's a problem with that. It might be better to say that we want to either define this maybe at a config time where the client has to resolve those conflicts explicitly, as Rob was mentioning in his presentation, or maybe it's something where we have these Uber schema on the device, and there is just one or a set of schema that are supported. And maybe, for example, IETF version 1, IETF version 2, and that includes all of the IETF modules and those are a package, I should say, at a specific revision and version. That means the conflicts are resolved. It's clear what the client would be getting in terms of an overall schema, and you don't have this kind of Frankensteining of putting together different potentially incompatible sets of packages. In terms of recommendations, I said earlier myself personally, I like the kind of Uber or predefined schema that is free of conflicts that we know is going to work. I don't know if we have a design team consensus on that, but that is one of the things we've been talking about very seriously in some of the latest meetings I've been a part of. But that's an item for discussion. 2, we have, Rob mentioned the data store relationship. We now have a one-to-N relationship between the data store and the schema that could be defining it. How do we handle those conflicts? This potentially goes away if we use those local packages that Rob talked about. Meaning, I could on the device say, I want to define a package config-wise. I want to define a package that has these sub-packages in it, and then I can specifically, as part of the config, say, this is how I handle the potential conflicts between the modules, as Rob mentioned, or the devices just define or the Yang servers, Yang-driven servers support a set of kind of overarching or Uber packages that define their schema, and that is at the level that the client can select. So we go back to still a one-to-one relationship. So related, do we need that superset schema? Rob mentioned the IETF, open config, native vendor. That is one way of resolving these conflicts, where the vendor pre-does it and says that we support a package called IETF-1.0.0, and we have offline this Yang instance data that shows what that package is, and the client therefore knows what to expect. Same thing with a 2.0.0. So that could include sub-packages around L2 VPN, L3 VPN, but the client selects, from a version selection standpoint, that overarching package, that overarching schema. The other thing is, how do we indicate what is a default schema and version? So default package, I should say. One of the things we talked about was having the semicolon notation and just say semicolon default and say as part of the capabilities exchange, this is the default. If you don't do that RPC, if you don't do anything, this is what you'll get. Likewise, something that we need to discuss is what recommendations might we want to give to implementers that says, how do I decide for clients that don't know anything about this? So this is a client that understands version selection and what they'll get by default. But what if a client doesn't yet understand anything about this? How do we support that client? We can give recommendations that say the default non-selected should be something that maintains backwards compatibility, let's say. So for example, we could give that recommendation, but again, we need to discuss how we go about handling the defaults, how we go about handling clients that do not make an explicit selection. At a time. Next steps, we pass it over to Rob.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson. The with defaults RFC actually defines how to handle defaults in the default capability. We could look at that.
Thanks.
How long have we got?
Technically 8 minutes, but.
Okay. So I'm going to try and get through this one. This is a new draft, so I can't rush it too quickly, but I do want to also try and get to the...
So we do have an extra 10 minutes in the next session.
Yeah.
So you can start now, and then we take the adoption question at the beginning of the next session. I'm just concerned that we might lose people. And actually, my co-chair may not be able to wake up because he stayed up late for NetConf.
Yeah.
So.
All right. I'll try and be quick.
Thanks.
So this is the last draft out of the set of 5. So this completes the solution. So what is Yang schema comparison? So effectively, this draft is defining algorithms to compare Yang modules and Yang schema to determine the scope of changes between different arbitrary revisions of versions. So it's similar to what we've already been talking about a lot about updating and using Yang Semver as modules change with MBC changes and backwards compatible changes. But the idea here is to define the tooling on how you do that. And the tooling would work both between modules that were within their history, but also if you have some sort of branching occurring between modules, the ability to compare versions between different branches. So the reason that this is important is because not in all cases does Semver solve all the issues. So there's some cases where you've got a branched revision and your client might be updating from one branch version to another, and they can't use the Semver rules to define whether or not that's backwards compatible changes. So this is tooling to do that. In addition to that, we're defining some extensions, optional extensions to provide some more annotations to when changes occur to modules in cases where it's ambiguous. So where your tooling cannot determine whether or not a change is backwards compatible or not, then the assumption will be, it'll default to be an MBC change unless you add an annotation to say that it's an editorial change or a backwards compatible change. This is a 0.0 revision. It was written last week. It was published on Saturday, Sunday. In terms of the actual solution, this has been discussed for quite a long time. It's merely a matter of writing it down, but this is a relatively new draft. So why do we want this? Well, revision labels and Yang Semver work in the mainline case. So if you're updating along a linear provision history, then it works quite well. But in the case you get to where it's branched, it is not so useful. You can't rely on just those Semver numbers. Second, the reason this is useful is in terms of actually getting the right Semver numbers or labeling modules with the correct MBC labels, it's useful if you've got tooling that can actually identify those rather than relying on humans doing it, because humans generally get it wrong. The third reason this is useful is that clients aren't impacted if the scheme has changed in the bits that they're not using. So if, for example, there's an MBC change in a feature that you're not using, then you don't really care about that. From your perspective, you're upgrading your software. You may see that change as effectively being a backwards compatible change because the MBC changes don't break you. And then finally, be able to define these standard annotations can help improve the accuracy of these comparison tools. So by having them defined in a standard, it means that any tools can work with those same definitions. In terms of the details, there's a generic tree comparison algorithm. It's not particularly magical in what it's doing. It's just walking down the trees, the schema trees, and comparing them. The comparison is performed via identifiers rather than the ordering. So that's a difference from what's in 7950. This means that you're allowed to reorder statements, okay, and that's not a problem. But it does add some other complexity. So that's one choice we've made there. The algorithm can either work on like a Yang package level, a full schema tree, or it can work on individual Yang modules. And in terms of the definition of the algorithm for Yang packages, we've just defined a standard version that sort of gives you the worst case scenario, and that's what's useful for defining what version the new package would be. And we've also defined options to give a sort of filtered version that is tuned to what clients might like to see. And then extension statements I mentioned. So to refine the comparison, I'll talk about those in a minute. I'll give examples. So the filtered version for the full Yang schema, so this is covering the case where, as I'm saying, it tries to answer the question from a client's perspective. It's moving from one software release to another is, okay, there might be some non-backwards compatible changes. Am I going to be affected by those? So the suggestion here is you could filter out some of these aspects because they probably are of less interest to the client. So if groupings have been changed in terms of the actual names of those groupings or they've moved around, that doesn't affect the scheme that's constructed. So probably clients won't care very much. If the module metadata information has changed, you probably don't care. You can restrict the comparison to the subset of features you actually care about and you're using them. You could restrict the comparison to the subset of the schema that's being used by the client. You could feed in some instance data document that says, this is the configuration I use, or you could feed in some XPath saying, this is the trees I'm interested in, so that the results of that comparison actually is tuned to what you're interested in. And finally, you could filter it out with editorial changes. So one of the things that comes up quite a lot is where we're fixing like description statements, improving those. The tooling will naturally flag those up as an MBC change because it can't tell when you change the description whether the semantics of the node has changed or whether it's just some sort of minor cleanup of those descriptions. So it gives a more refined answer. Some examples of how these things work, these annotations work. So I've got an example of fixing a description. So I've gone from revision 100 to 101. That's the standard module versioning update rules and the Semver being used there. And then at the bottom in that container foo, you can see that I've changed the description from do some stuff with misspelled. I fixed that, added a full stop, and I've now labeled that that is an editorial change. I've said which particular revision that editorial change has occurred in. So this means that a comparison tool that's comparing those two revisions can then know that this isn't a non-backwards compatible change that would flag up by default, but actually it's not of consequence. Another example, so this is a different label, is a different annotation. The draft defines an annotation for effectively being able to rename a node. So it's changed here from foo to bar. This change has been done in a non-backwards compatible way, so the module version has gone from 100 to 200, but you've got a label under the new container bar to say that it was related back to foo. So when the tooling is doing the comparison of the two trees, first of all, it would look for container bar in the old module, wouldn't find it. It would then see it's got renamed from foo and do the comparison against foo. So it allows you to do smarter changes, smarter comparisons, whereas by default, otherwise, you would flag it up as a delete and a create. We haven't necessarily figured out exactly what all of these things should be at this stage. It's just these are ideas of the sorts of things you would do. Yes, Chris.
So is the intention, would that be like a Unix rename, like move? Can I move it from foo at the root to inside a container and say renamed?
At the moment it's just defined in the same place in the tree, but yes, it potentially could be. So, yeah.
By the way, Chris, name?
Chris Hops.
So I think, to clarify, I think that's a detail that we need to work out. And we need to work out what these extra annotations should be, which ones are useful. So the next steps, so one of the questions is, this defines various extensions to the module versioning things. It could be done in the module versioning draft, IETF Yang revisions. It's in a new module within this draft, so it's a question of where that goes. We need to work exactly what those annotations are needed and useful. Again, I think that could be done after working group adoption. And there's one question is, do we need an annotation to mark something as MBC? At the moment, it only defines, it assumes MBC by default if it doesn't know, and then adds annotations to say it's either backwards compatible or editorial. And then another question that's come up is the revision renamed from label allows you to rename it, but doesn't specify exactly when that's occurred. And I think that's probably sufficient, but there are scenarios if you were to swap the two names of two containers, or you rename one and introduce a new container with that same old label, then you'd have issues. So some details to be worked out there. But I think these could also be figured out after working with adoption.
Great.
Right, yeah.
All right, thank you. We see that people are already streaming out because we are out of time. We're going to take the first 10 minutes of the next session to discuss adoption. There has been some interesting conversation already taking place in Jabber that wanted to be channeled, and we ran out of time, so we're going to do that first 10 minutes. So please come back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and remember, we're in a different room. Blue sheets?
Pretty much. I got everyone, even those people who just transitioned their way.
We went around like 5 times.
Yeah. It's just
Yeah,
like,
we've been doing
I
blue
think
sheets.
we
got it
got the
covered.
Virginia snoozes.
That was especially you. It really was. And one last round.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have seen the general problem with my notification capability